Thank you. Good morning, and we'll reconvene the hearing considering the submissions to the SESM chapter as it was notified. And the point that we got to yesterday was that we were about to commence questions of the reporters to Council and possibly get some input also from Matt Heal from a more strategic view. Was there anything that you wanted to add before we start asking questions?
I've got some spoken evidence to go through to start us off with, if that's okay. So as we're all aware, my name is Courtney Bennett, and I'm appearing on behalf of Gore District Council. Section 42A report sets out my qualifications and experience. I've prepared a statement of supplementary evidence to provide a response to expert evidence presented in relation to Hearing Stream 8 site scenarios of significance to Māori. This has been tabled and I'm taking it as read. Today I'll provide a verbal summary, some responses to some questions that were raised yesterday as well, and then be happy to answer questions. A quick note for the panel. In my Section 42A report, I referred to groups of similar submissions as being Federated Farmers-led submissions or Stony Creek-led submitters. To clarify, this did not mean that these groups of submitters were being formally led or were affiliated with either Federated Farmers or Stony Creek. Rather, it meant that individual submitters had chosen to support submission points lodged by either Federated Farmers or Stony Creek, or that the individuals had lodged submissions with wording identical to either of these submitters. To avoid confusion or misrepresentation, these references should be updated to Southern Federated Farmers et al. Or Stony Creek et al. Within my Section 42A report. The Council received expert evidence from two submitters in response to the SESM chapter, Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga and Hokonui Runanga. Since the panel has chosen to split the chapter across multiple hearings, we anticipate evidence from other submitters being lodged at a later date. Evidence was received from James Sutherland on behalf of Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga. Mr. Sutherland expressed support for the changes Hokonui Runanga have proposed to the notified mana whenua chapter, subject to updating the references to their organisation and its primary legislation, which Commissioner Hovell pointed out yesterday as well. I acknowledge this evidence from Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga and support the minor referencing amendments they propose. Cultural evidence was received from Terry Nicholas on behalf of Hokonui Runanga. I acknowledge that evidence. Expert planning evidence was also received from Amy Beran on behalf of Hokonui Runanga. Ms Beran covered several matters in her evidence which we heard from yesterday, but as a reminder, it included clarifying that Hokonui Runanga is no longer seeking a new policy, SASM XX, confirming her support for the suite of objectives and policies that both her and I have jointly recommended for inclusion in the mana whenua chapter under minute 15, discussion of their newly proposed Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter, and the diverging recommendations of Council and Hokonui Runanga as to whether a suite of methods should be included in the mana whenua chapter. As highlighted by Ms Beran at the time of writing the Section 42A report, I chose to reserve my assessment of the Hokonui proposal to replace the SESM chapter with the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter. This decision was intentional, born from an abundance of caution. The PDP approach to SESM has attracted significant interest within the community, with many holding strong views, including views around process. The Section 42A report was the first opportunity for the public to see and consider the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter proposal. I considered it important to emphasise that Council did not hold a preconceived position on this chapter before the public had an opportunity to speak to the Council about their thoughts. Therefore, I elected not to include a full assessment of the proposal in the 42A report, and I stand by that decision. My intention was to instead share my assessment as part of my supplementary evidence. That way, I'd have the benefit of hearing the perspectives of all submitters through the evidence to assist me to make a fully informed assessment. In light of the changes to the SASM hearing timetable, though, and the fact that all submitters have now had time to consider the proposal, I consider it appropriate to provide an initial assessment and have done so in my tabled supplementary evidence. As I said earlier, I'm taking my supplementary evidence as read. However, in summary, I'm currently supportive of the Hokonui Runanga proposal. However, this may change dependent on evidence from other submitters once that's received. As set out in my supplementary evidence, I do not see a technical planning reason why the SASM chapter cannot be replaced with their proposed Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter. It's permitted under the national planning standards. It will not substantially alter the way that the proposed district plan functions, and the proposed Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter complies with the requirements of higher order documents. As pointed out by Hokonui Runanga though, replacing the SASM chapter with their proposed Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter may help alleviate misunderstandings and public concern around the SASM approach within the PDP. For this reason, I tentatively support the proposal. In terms of the Minute 15 amendments proposed to the Mana Whenua chapter, I confirm that Ms Barron and I are in agreement on amendments to the body of the chapter and the wording of the proposed objectives and policies. I also confirm that we continue to have differing views on the use of methods in the chapter. Whilst I accept that there is nothing in the national planning standards that preclude the use of methods, I don't think that we should use them purely because we can. Council has made every effort to draft a plan that is as straightforward as possible for the public to use and understand, considering it's a planning document. At the moment, it includes 4 types of provisions: has objectives, policies, rules, and standards. I'm reluctant to add a 5th type of provision, methods, especially if there will only be 3 methods in the whole plan anyway. As set out in my supplementary evidence, I agree that the content of these methods is valuable. I also think, however, that this content can be re-recorded in other ways that would avoid introducing another layer of complexity to the plan. For example, the helpful guidance around when a resource consent application may require a cultural values report could be included as explanatory text under section 5 of the Mana Whenua chapter, involvement and participation with Mana Whenua, as opposed to being a standalone method in its own area. Similarly, I suggest that the methods that discuss council staff professional development and creation of public resources could be better placed in other council documents. I have a few notes from yesterday as well, which are a bit of a hodgepodge of bits and bobs, but we'll fly through them. Yesterday, some concerns were raised about removing the archaeological protections for places such as the Matoda Falls and Tuturo. I think it's important to point out that the Matoda Falls have another layer of protection being listed as an outstanding natural feature or landscape? Feature. Outstanding natural feature. So that listing was intentional and born largely from its cultural significance through there, and that triggers a range of assessments through that role. As I understand it, Tuturo has some historic heritage protections because of the obelisk on site and its surrounding area. So they're not left with nothing, they just don't have that element. Concerns were raised by Commissioner Havel about the amount of time it would take to rejig all the referencing throughout the plan if we were to amend to a Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values plan. I've done that about 3 times. It takes about 2 hours. It's not I
wasn't raising it as a problem. I was highlighting the number that are there to make sure that we get them right.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long to do that. Yeah.
And using the facilities available on a computer, it's very quick.
Yeah. What else do I have in my phone list?
It took me 10 minutes to work out how many there were.
Yeah. Kapo. Questions were raised around having the English translation of the various Ngāi Tahu cultural values in the policy, and I'd just like to point us back to the Mana Whenua chapter where each of those values has a definition and explanation already in the plan. So that'll be there, that's already in there. A question was also raised around having an English translation for the pepeha at the start of the Mana Whenua chapter. That's already in there. So the paragraph directly following that pepeha is the English equivalent to what's in there. It just doesn't have the fancy formatting as the pepeha, but the content's exactly the same.
So what's in the copy attached to your evidence is the pepeha's there, then there's a paragraph crossed out in red, and then a heading that says 2.2.
Yes, so all of that content in 2.2 is the exact same content that's in that pepeha. It's just packaged slightly differently, but the content is the same. It's the same thing. What's next on my list? Oh, the question was raised around the use of the term some Ngāi Tahu cultural values are, and then the list of those in the Mana Whenua chapter. So we'll all remember that this was a matter that was brought up at the Mana Whenua hearing as well. And in response to that, when we've gone back to the SASM chapter or Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter, because the policy is the same, what we've done to add that clarity that you're seeking is that in the objective that lists all of the relevant Ngāi Tahu cultural values for consideration in the plan, we've made it very clear in that objective that that list are the only ones relevant to decision making in the plan. That gives us the ability to be more flexible in the text of the Mana Whenua chapter to more accurately say this is not every value that Ngāi Tahu have in their culture, because that's just unrealistic. But what we're using the objective to say is that there may be other values, but they're not to be considered in decision making in the plan, and that makes it very clear cut.
So what you've just said, why can't we express that in that sentence instead?
Because we have.
To me, some of these are listed below what you've just described as those that are important for the purpose of the plan are.
That's what the policy, the objective's for. Because what's been asked for in the Mana Whenua chapter is a description of Ngāi Tahu values. It's not saying just ones for the plan. So it's giving it that flexibility to honour the fact that a whole culture cannot be described in one section of a district plan. But then for the functional use of the plan, which I acknowledge is very important as well, it's the purpose of having the document, we've put that in the policy which actually has statutory weight to it. There was a few other, a question was raised around references to multiple accidental discovery protocols. So one being in the iwi management plan and one being with Heritage New Zealand. So a comparison of the two has been done since yesterday, and there are some minor differences, mostly around discovery of in situ pounamu. So that's the main difference between the two. So yeah, they're slightly different. So I agree with you that we need to have a clear direction in the plan of which one to do. So that's something that I'm sure we can go away and address. There was a question around a gap analysis kind of piece of work, identifying all of the references to Ngāi Tahu cultural values in the plan, and particularly how they link to the Mana Whenua policy that has those kind of categories of things. That work's been done. I'm more than happy to share that with you if you need as well. That's everything that I've got on my list. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Morning, and kia ora for that. It's a really good wrap up from yesterday. So I think you would have picked up that the reason for thinking about the gap analysis and knowing that it was visible was around getting that precision and clarity around the function of the Mana Whenua chapter and the function of the chapter that's going to hold effects management. And I think thinking about what happened with the natural character chapter, that analysis of the linkages and maybe where the gaps were was a driver for thinking that further guidance was needed and a further chapter was needed. So I think you've put on the table for us quite clearly in your supplementary statement that the national planning standards do envisage this, that there would be a Mana Whenua chapter and that there will be another chapter that's managing effects. or that it's available to have another chapter that's managing effects. And I think in Commissioner Havel's questioning yesterday, he was pointing to another piece of the National Planning Standards that was speaking about the threading through. And so I think we all understand from the number of references through the plan that there is a threading through that has been achieved. And so it's really more, I guess, additional evidence showing the need to have the standalone guidance that then also connects to the threads. I do think it would be helpful for us to have that.
Absolutely.
And even just looking at how we approached the natural character, which was really quite simple, I guess. And I think the difference here is that we have a lot more references. But I think it really would be helpful to kind of add to the suite of evidence that's sitting in behind this proposal. And it will help for the reasons that you've just outlined in your supplementary in terms, in your statement, being mindful of that there's a lot of focus and concern, and that lots of what's happening through this hearing process is responding to submissions and finding, the settling on the right approach. It's not just the right approach, it's probably the one that is most clear, the one that is most clear for all parties involved around what is intended to be achieved through the cultural values provision. So would definitely welcome, I think, as a panel, that evidence in addition. So then probably, I was going to ask you if you'd had any further thoughts about the methods, with Ms. Beran sort of saying, well, actually there is something distinct about this chapter that is different to the other chapters in the plan. And what I heard from you is you heard that yesterday and it hasn't changed your position. And I think in your evidence and in dialogue with Ms. Beran yesterday, the idea about where the text was held, whether it was a method or in the text of the overview or an advice note, in all of those examples, this was our dialogue, in all those examples, there are elements that are informing but are not in the statutory. But then I thought about that overnight and I thought, well, is there a potential difference in terms of the methods having a bit more statutory weight? That a method is a direction, that this is how we will, that is slightly different to an advice note or useful information sitting in the overview. So just interested in whether you perceive a difference there, and whether the methods would have more statutory weight.
I think, yeah. My initial thoughts on that is that, yes, there are pros and cons to having those methods in there. Ms. Beran and I are both in agreement that the content is valuable. Content is valuable, it needs to go somewhere, but on balance, I don't think that including them as a method is worth all of the cons of doing that. As I said, there's 3 methods across the whole plan, and I can envision a time where we've got communities saying, well, what's the difference between the methods and the rules? And how do the policies and the methods, how does this all fit together? When I feel like that's an unnecessary level of complication, particularly because of the content of them. they're things that I don't think need potentially that high level of statutory weight to improve how useful they are to the community and the council. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yesterday, Commissioner Hovell asked that I go and have a look at how everything might fit together with the Urban Form and Development chapter, and I also looked right through the Ngāi Tahu cultural value objectives and policies and the mana whenua methods. So I've got a review of that here that I can hand around and just take you through that if that would be helpful.
And I guess just for Courtney Bennett, while you're handing it around, one of those methods relating to staff training and the like, I felt was the memorandum of understanding
I agree.
issue. And the other ones, I made the comment that maybe they can be in a brochure, which is more directive, so it actually picks up the people that need to know
Absolutely.
it. So your view on that?
Yeah, some of that information is potentially already in the consent application information that
Yes, of
future
course.
applicants, yeah.
Yes.
So that just really goes back to what I'm saying about, yes, the content's useful, but is this the right place for some of it?
Yeah.
Method 1, which speaks about when the Runanga may think it's more important to have a higher level of cultural values report done, absolutely useful, and of the three, I consider that to be the most useful to be in that mana whenua chapter. I still don't think it needs to be a method though. I think that it sits quite nicely, as you'll see in my supplementary evidence. It sits quite sensibly in that section 5 with other information about engagement and things like that. And I don't think that not having it in a special little box that said method takes any importance away from that information.
So I'll just talk you through this. I might start at the methods, given we're talking about them now. So if you just flick over the page, you'll see in the right-hand column, halfway down, mana whenua M1, first method, M2, second method, M3, third method. And in the right-hand column, I'm just indicating that methods typically don't have a lot of statutory weight. And so I think it was Council for the Runanga yesterday in his evidence was talking about, in particular, Section 88, which is around the information you need to provide with a consent. Section 104, the matters you need to consider when you're assessing a consent, and Section 95, which is around notification. In particular, Section 88. Sorry. Sure. Okay. So, in particular, Section 88 directs you to look at the objectives and policies, not the methods. So, what I'm saying is that's part of the reason we haven't got methods in the plan, because they have limited statutory weight. And most recent plans that I've reviewed don't use methods. So, I've got some examples there. Wellington, Selwyn District, Te Potini Plan, which is the West Coast Plan, and Christchurch City Plan don't include methods. If you want these matters to have statutory weight, there's an option of including these elements in the policy. So I've given an example there in the right-hand column, MW Policy 3. You could add the elements of those methods into that policy. So in D, that's around information resources and education. And E is around cultural impact assessments, although I think
Cultural values reports.
they've changed their wording to cultural value reports.
That was the question that I was going to ask yesterday, but when I looked at Ms. Beerin's evidence, it was not there. It was in your supplementary, where I saw that change as well, and that is a question that I want to ask.
So,
I don't know if I do that now.
I'll just say this is titled Draft Policy Straw Person for Testing because it was pulled together last night, and I think one of the other key points from yesterday that both legal counsel were highlighting is that mana whenua should be heavily involved in determining how cultural values are reflected across the plan. So this is very much a quick review of what was prepared yesterday and some options about how things could be done differently, but they have pros and cons, which I can talk about as we go through. So I've talked you through the methods. If there's any questions around that, I can take those now and then go through the objectives and policies if you like, or do the whole thing and then come back. Okay, so if we go back to the front of the document, so on the right-hand column, we've got Objective 1 from the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter. I had a look at the Urban Form and Development chapter, which I see as urban form and development, not urban form and urban development. Okay, so
There's a comma, yeah.
yeah. And so that first objective, urban form and development, 01, covers things like cultural values, and it's got that reference at the moment to MW 2.3, because at the time we didn't have Objective 02. And relationship of mana whenua with whenua, wai and mahinga kai, and responding to the underlying relationships Ngāi Tahu hold with the natural environment. So in a sense, the concepts in NTCV 01 are picked up already in the Urban Form and Development chapter. Okay, so potentially that Urban Form and Development chapter could be tweaked if you were minded to get rid of the NTCV.
So what I was wondering, when I looked at the two, straight off the bat, I could see a bit of difference in focus. So
Yep.
when I look at UFD 01, it's really thinking about how the district develops. It's developing in a cohesive and structured way. When I read, and I think there are some words missing when I read NTCV 01, potentially, because when I was reading it, I was thinking this is what you're doing in decision making, and so the words in decision making might be missing. So I was thinking that they had slightly different purposes, but if we haven't been clear about those different purposes, then we might need some extra text.
Yeah, I think the point I'm going to get to is that potentially you could, move those two objectives into the Urban Form and Development chapter, but that would then leave you with a NTCV chapter that just has policies in it, which isn't a good outcome. And the purpose of the Urban Form and Development chapter, and the reason it's only got objectives, is because it's guiding other chapters in the plan. So, for example, if you take a zone, it's telling you what needs to happen between zones. The zone objectives are telling you what needs to happen within the zone. Okay, so if we apply that same principle to Ngāi Tahu cultural values, then it's okay to have a separate objective in the Urban Form and Development chapter that's around development, but I think it's still important to have an objective in a Ngāi Tahu cultural value chapter, particularly if you are going to have policies that need to hang off an objective. So the point of this being a straw person is to say, well, you asked me to go and look at it, I've looked at it, these are the implications, and we can certainly test that further as part of the testing that I talked about needing to be done further.
This actually leads me to a question that didn't come up yesterday, but obviously national planning standard reasons why UFD sits in the plan where it is and Mana Whenua sits in the plan where it is, and so that dialogue around flow through at the top of the plan is in part dictated by the national planning standards. And so this, would I be right to assume, because I haven't until this moment gone back to double check, that the Ngāi Tahu Cultural Values chapter is envisaged structurally to be in a similar position in the plan as the SESM chapter is directed to be positioned in the plan by the National Planning Standards?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
And I
need to
hadn't,
have a-
until this very
yeah.
moment, it hadn't occurred to me to think
Need-
about that differently.
need to have a look, because it could sit where, yeah, it could sit where the SASM chapter is, which is around cultural values, which kind of makes sense. But equally, potentially, it could sit under the strategic direction part of the plan, which is where the urban form and development chapter sits. But I haven't looked specifically at the National Planning Standards, so I can clarify that for you later.
I think that would be great because, yeah,
The challenge that I guess I was putting forward yesterday is that even in terms of the policies that are in the values chapter as drafted, I felt that when you look at the detail in the planning standards, they could go into the Mana Whenua chapter. And that's what I'm asking the people to go. I don't want a response today, please. I don't think it's appropriate to sit there shaking your head. What I'm asking is for the planners to go away and have a look at that as an option of the pros and cons and looking at the detail of what is in the planning standards. Because I think the weakness in terms of what the planners have done is that you've gone away and reached an agreement in terms of what you see as appropriate, whereas it would have been good to have actually give us a breakdown of the process that you've gone through to get there and the options, so that we could be fully understanding that what you're promoting is the best way to go. So I'm really asking you to go back and fill in the gaps for us so that we've got an understanding as to why that is appropriate, and now why there's been some section 32AA analysis done. In my view, the other options haven't been looked at to a degree that I'm comfortable with.
So you're wanting us to look at the structural options in more detail?
Yes, because clearly some of those policies, in my view, can go into Mana Whenua.
So
and if there are some left, how are they dealt with? And that's why I turn to the urban form development, because I see a clear need for step one, and what you've picked up here is that there's already the base for it sitting there. So what is to be gained by repeating that somewhere else? So that's what I'm looking for.
So we do, like I said, the urban form and development is kept high level, so we're not repeating ourselves when we get down to the other chapters in the plan. In this table, what I've done, I've gone through the policies and looked at which ones I think are effects-based policies as opposed to process and context-based policies, because the planning standard says process context, Mana Whenua chapter, not effects policies. Okay, so what I've done here is a preliminary analysis of that. So for example, if we look at NTCV P1, it's around how we deal with adverse effects of land use development and subdivision. So I see that as an effects-based policy, not a context policy, and not a process policy. And so what I'm saying is I think it's important that it has a home outside the Mana Whenua chapter, and that if you were minded to remove Objective 02, let's say, then it could refer back to the values in the Mana Whenua chapter, which are expressed in NW 2.3. there's a risk with that because, as Ms Bennett said, the NTCV02 is limiting the matters of decision making to those specific matters. Kaitiakitanga, whakapapa, etc. Whereas at the moment, MW 2.3 isn't an exhaustive list. So, and also, as I said before, removing the objectives would only leave you with a chapter with policies in it, which isn't best practice. So I've done some preliminary analysis of the question you're raising.
I guess if the mana whenua chapter is setting out the values, is it a process issue as to how those values are implemented through the plan?
I think it's difficult, and this is why I've said this is only a straw person for testing and we need to involve mana whenua in this discussion, because some mana whenua values are difficult to differentiate as to whether they are process matters or effects matters, because how you deal with the process can lead to an effect, right? If you're not following due process, then you'll get a bad outcome or a negative effect. So
perhaps I can illustrate that with an example. So kaitiakitanga, if you are not able to exercise kaitiakitanga, then that is an effect has flow-on effects. So that's not an environmental effect that you perhaps are slightly more familiar with applying, but there are flow-on effects. Would you agree with that?
So why isn't kaitiakitanga a process?
The processes that are in place enable kaitiakitanga to be exercised. So can I give an example from a resource consent process? If a resource consent is not sought, so the process that's followed at the moment, as Mr. Nicholas discussed yesterday, is that it's then referred to Hokonui Runanga to consider. 99% of the time they endorse it, and that is an exercise of kaitiakitanga because it gives Hokonui a chance to consider, have a look at what's happening, make sure that it's not inflicting on cultural values that they are wholly wanting to ensure are protected. So it's a process which enables the exercise of kaitiakitanga. It's that it's translated poorly into English as stewardship.
Yeah, but
Is it also that there are naturally two parts to kaitiakitanga? So you've got the ability to exercise part, which is the process and context matter, process matter, but then the way in which it is exercised, i.e. the choices that are made to manage effects once you've... So it's kaitiakitanga in itself, so I'm seeing you nodding, so has these two parts to it, the effects management part and the process part. So
my initial response would be the effects management part probably translates better in a district plan context because you understand it's managing an environmental effect. But yes, so I think you're right, the exercise of kaitiakitanga as a active step, and then there's also the process which enables that oversight, which is stewardship in a different sense, which is less active, more considered.
But aren't the effect side of it dealt with in the individual rules?
well, the rules may require input from mana whenua to the process. So if you need a resource consent, there's a matter of discretion that talks about needing to consider Ngāi Tahu cultural values. You look at what they are in the mana whenua chapter, which we're talking about one, kaitiakitanga. So you'll have to go and engage with you potentially need to engage with iwi or mana whenua and understand what the effects of the activity are in relation to kaitiakitanga. So it's not, so the process of involving mana whenua in the consent is part of kaitiakitanga, but how that consent is implemented is also an element of kaitiakitanga.
And so what you just said there was you may have to go and talk to mana whenua to understand what the appropriate response is in terms of effects management. And the other place you can go, presumably, is the iwi management plan, where certain kinds of management responses are outlined.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I saw policy 1 with that list as being the trigger as to the ones that will require consultation.
Sorry, which policy? one?
MWP one, I think he's talking
sure.
about, because I had a question around that, but
It's not on here. Yeah, so there's a process element. Like I said, there's a process element and an effects element, which means it's difficult to put it all in the mana whenua chapter. I suppose the other thing we've been talking about, for example, is tūtaro, okay? So how you might deal with that if you don't have a, well, where you deal with that in the plan, if it is of particular interest to mana whenua. If you haven't got a Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter, then where would that sit? That's another element, I guess, that runs through this.
And the reference yesterday, and I think the comments that came this morning in terms of the falls being listed as an outstanding feature and it has cultural values is an important point that was made. And for Tūtarau, it's the obelisk that's in the plan.
And the surrounding.
And that includes the surrounding area, which in terms of the information layer of the plan as well, is able to show that area as a flag that it's like something.
so I think that was our dialogue earlier in the week, which was for the obelisk in the setting, because I specifically asked that question, is a much smaller area than, and at the moment the information layer does not have anything in that area. So I think it's that we're talking about, the difference between, because we did have that dialogue and the schedule does provide some protection, but only in that immediate
That's correct.
vicinity.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this is really, this piece of work is really looking at, well, could you get rid of the Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter and rely on other bits of the plan? My initial view is probably not, because I think you need the objectives to guide the policies. The policies aren't context or process alone. One of them potentially is, and therefore I think you need a Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter
Or
in
SESM chapter, depending on.
Yeah.
delivering on the planning standards.
And the way this would work functionally then, if you're in another chapter and you've got an objective or policy that's making some reference, is this, if you're doing the whole of plan read, you would then be able to pull on what's sitting in the whatever title it's given chapter,
Just like,
and that they then inform each other in the
Yes.
context of that case. And yeah,
That's correct, which is just like you'd do with the urban form and development chapter in a zone setting, so which is probably of interest. So say you get a plan change request in 5 years' time, which is wanting to expand your industrial zone, let's say, you'd go to your urban form and development chapter, because that's about where development should go across the district. So it's not uncommon to have higher order objectives in the plan where they don't usefully sit within another chapter of the plan. So it's not an uncommon thing.
All right, that's probably as far as we can take it today.
I did have a question because in your table I don't see like you just focused on what's sitting in the proposed NTCV, and I did wonder if you had any thoughts about MWP1, because I was looking at MWP1 a little differently to Commissioner Havell. Like when I saw that, I thought because it's got effects triggers, which we did get to yesterday, so I hope somebody spoken to Miss Spearin. Yeah, that it might also be effects based.
I can give a bit more context around that specific policy. So as you remember from minute 15, we were asked to provide some clarity and some process and matters like that into the Mana Whenua chapter. So what we've done, and I can provide the background homework to you guys if you want, is we took all of the provisions that have links to Ngaito cultural values, and we did a theming exercise. And once we boiled those 89 activities down into sensible groups, that's what's in there. So there was a group of provisions that could be grouped together and called activities in close proximity to streams. So that might be 12 different provisions. They might be all in different zones, but that's their general theme. So the purpose of this policy was to give people an overview of where in the chapter they might find these triggers. So it's really a signposting policy more than anything else, provided specifically in response to minute 15 and requests for that more clarity around where people can expect to have to start thinking about Ngaito cultural values. The reason that it says effects on relevant cultural values considered where resource consent in any of the following activities, the reason that it's still quite broad is because, yes, there's all of these categories, for want of a better term, but they're only relevant if you need a resource consent. So if you're doing an activity in close proximity to a river or stream and it doesn't require a resource consent, you don't have to worry about Ngaito cultural values. If you're doing an activity within an outstanding natural feature or landscape overlay and it doesn't require a resource consent, you don't need to think about Ngaito values. That's why there's that ambiguity in this policy, because if we were to be more specific, you would end up having to list all of them, and that's already in the plan. That's duplicating content.
I don't see an ambiguity. I think it's quite clear that it's only where there's a resource consent required. My concern is that there's still the amount of vagueness that's there I would like to see refined.
I'm wondering about the word some that was causing, that came up yesterday.
That's what I'm responding to, yes.
Yeah, and I think, so I don't want to take your question. Do you want to ask your question?
That's right. I was just going to ask that same question.
But I wondered when I was seeing that something could happen up in the entry string that could take away the need for that word. So what I understand when I look at it is not all activities that breach bulk location or height standards are going to have this hook, but some will. And the ones that will are presumably in settings or situations, like there are different, I think the difficulty in the dialogue that was happening yesterday was this, what are the situations and cases where this is true? And I think, well, all of that, as you've just said, is sitting in the individual provisions themselves. So it might just need a little bit of text up the front that takes away the need for the sum.
That's sensible.
Yeah. And then, yeah. And I like your description of a signpost, because that does seem to me to be what it's doing.
Just referring to that, to the word some. Did you, like when you say some, do you just mean activities that need resource consent?
Yes.
Is that what you were referring
Yes.
to?
No.
Yeah.
Because there will be a range of activities. So if we take, for example, if some activities breaching bulk location and height standards, there will also be some activities that breach bulk locational height standards that, because of the matters of discretion on the individual rules, do not require consideration of this. Or there'll be some activities that do. So that's exactly right.
that's what-
Yes.
And there'll be a reference to Ngāi Tahu cultural
Yeah.
values and the matter of discretion.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions from the panel with regard to the table on that issue? And we'll move on to the evidence then.
I just want to say it's helpful and thank you for doing that overnight. It's really helpful.
Ms Bennett, can I turn to your evidence and looking at page 11 of your preliminary, of your first report, paragraph 32 and 33, you have talked in the third line of 32 that the Runanga and Council have met informally, and in 33 Council has also attended informal meetings. Was that at a staff level or did it involve the Council as a corporate body? Yes, yes.
Is it, yeah,
I'm gonna-
representing staff.
Pass that one over there.
So we'll maybe just explain the
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. So, particularly the meeting between Hokonui Runanga and Southland Federated Farmers, I can talk to that. Hokonui Runanga and Southland Federated Farmers independently decided to have their own meeting to discuss matters around sites and areas of significance, and they reached out to the planning team and said we would find it useful to have somebody from the council planning team present to help us interpret the proposed district plan. So I was tasked with that job, and that was the role. We didn't contribute to their conversations, we were just there to answer interpretation of plan questions for them.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's what I anticipated.
Yeah.
And it could be read that elected councillors, i.e. the council, attended these meetings, whereas it was the
Council staff.
the advisors to the hearing committee and other council staff who attended the meetings.
That would be
Right,
correct.
so I just wanted that entered into the
Yeah.
record.
You may have corrected this, Courtney, when you first spoke about Stony Creek Station, limited-led group, and it isn't a group. That is what you're referring to when you...
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. In the supplementary evidence at page 11, it's the one further over, apologies, at page 15, the NTCV policy 2 talks about impacts of land use, etc., on Ngāi Tahu cultural values are determined in partnership with the Hokonui Runanga.
Can you just clarify which evidence you're looking at? Is
Yeah,
it
yeah, the supplementary
supplementary
Yeah.
evidence?
to the 42A, page 15.
Yeah, that's the subs. Page 15.
Yes,
So my page 15 is track changes to the Mana Whenua chapter
yes.
and looking at Mana Whenua local
Well,
authority relationships.
I've got it in green on this document.
Is it the appendix?
Yes, the appendix.
The appendix got it, independent page numbers or something.
Oh, it might do.
So,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Is your supplementary page 15 dated 4th December?
Yeah, cool, got it.
So the policy 2 talks about things being determined in partnership with the Hokanui Runanga.
Correct.
Determining in partnership, what does that mean?
As a team, working together.
So does that mean there is a joint decision made at the formal decision-making process?
I wouldn't anticipate that because, to my knowledge, that's not an option within.
Because one could say determining in partnership means they are part of it. Now, in the same way that we've got one commissioner here who is representing or the acceptance of Runanga, if there is a large consent come in that has impacts on Ngāi Tahu values, then it would be appropriate to have a commissioner sitting as part of the decision-making process. But the way this is written, determined in partnership, I'm reading it as the decision-making process, not the processing process.
So I look at it taking a step back from that. You're not talking about making the decision on the application. You're talking about making decisions and understanding the impacts on Ngāi Tahu cultural values.
So could you use a different word instead of?
Yeah, so you're not making decisions, you're working together to understand.
Understood. Yeah, understood.
Yeah, because you're making decisions on the impact, not on the outcome of the decision.
No, you're not making decisions, you're pulling together information. It isn't the role of the staff to make the decisions. It's the role of the person with the delegation or hearing committee to make a decision.
Considered.
I think determined is the wrong,
Yeah.
is.
We can look at some rewording to that.
Yeah.
It's just a different word there.
So the intent is that in order to understand the impact of these things on Ngāi Tahu cultural values, that there needs to be
Absolutely.
a dialogue.
Absolutely.
The understanding can't be done in isolation.
Correct.
Correct. It's just that the word partnership has a particular meaning to many people.
And it comes back to that submission I gave yesterday, which is that it is mana whenua who are the people that you need to talk to understand cultural values. So I do think it's determined as potentially the word that's creating the confusion
Yes,
here.
yes. Policy 5 talks about urban design of publicly accessible spaces, which is really a council directive thing. I saw that as something more for the memorandum of understanding rather than a policy in the plan, because it impacts on council land. In the same way that when you walk into the library, there's these absolutely glorious panels on top that, and that was done because of the relationship outside of the plan process. And so I don't see that policy as actually sitting in the plan process.
I definitely take your point. For context of where this policy came from memory, it links to some of the provisions in the specific zone chapters that talk about considering reflecting Ngāi Tahu cultural values in development. So it speaks directly to those from memory. But I take the point, if that was to be removed, then we'd be looking at all of those other bits of the plan that they link into as well.
Yeah, because I think something that's come out of, well, my personal view is, having had a look at the memorandum yesterday and overnight, I think that it is the district plan outcomes provide an excellent opportunity to revisit that and refresh it in terms of some of the things that are coming out of the plan.
Yeah.
Are there other questions from the panel in terms of the evidence?
Probably when I just have an allergic reaction from a linguistic perspective to NTCVP4 ending on a preposition. I would want to rejig. So,
Recognise and provide for it.
Yeah.
yeah,
That's a very
it's a
valid
small
allergy.
thing, and if it wasn't corrected in evidence, it would probably end up corrected in decision. But just an alert, really.
That's very valid.
Anything from you, Phil?
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Maria.
Yeah, so these words here need to go at the front because proper English. you
It's a
shouldn't
grammar
get the
issue.
word for at the end. However, through common usage, it's becoming more and more common, and therefore you'll find that's probably now acceptable in the Oxford Dictionary. Any other matters?
No, I think it's been really helpful to have some additional thoughts around the importance of having the two chapters working, and whatever they're called, they're doing different jobs, and hearing and having the initial analysis here. You've already provided us, Mr. Hill, with some rationale why the absence of either a SESM chapter or a Ngāi Tahu cultural values chapter would be problematic, and that sort of provides an umbrella for any gap analysis that might come through. I think you've already effectively given a rationale, and so the gap analysis that was being talked about, I guess, would be fleshing that out. What was my question? Yes, the question that I was holding off on was the difference between a cultural values report and a cultural impact assessment. And so my understanding is that these are two different things and they have two different jobs as well. So if you could just talk through that change, that would be quite helpful, because I want to know that we're not lopping off something we should also have, or, yeah.
So the change from referring to cultural impact assessments to cultural values reports as opposed to a cultural values assessment, that was a conversation that Ms. Barron and I had late on Wednesday, which is why it might not have come across in both sets of evidence. As you'll be aware, cultural impact assessments are a very specific thing. It's a very specific type of report. The discussions that Ms. Barron and I had was, does Hokonui Runanga want to limit itself to this very one specific tool, or do they want to have the flexibility to use the right tool for the right job? And by using a much broader term such as a cultural values report, that's more of it's a bigger box to put things in. What we're trying to avoid is a situation where provisions in the plan require the runanga to do this very in-depth assessment for everything all the time, because community members likely don't want that. From the conversations had with Ms. Barron, it sounds like the runanga do not want to be doing overly involved reports for things that don't require them. So by using that broader term of cultural values report, it creates that flexibility to use the right tool for the right job. A cultural values report in some situations could be a one-page saying, we understand this is what you want to do, we see a minor issue around X, here's something that we recommend putting in, full stop, the end, compared to a cultural impact assessment, which can take weeks to do. And nobody wants to force people to write big reports and pay for them that aren't necessary. So that's why Ms. Barron and I agreed on changing that terminology to create that flexibility.
And I wondered, to me, when I was thinking about the two different things, that was really helpful, because my my thinking had gone somewhere else, so I'm going to test this too, that the term cultural values report, so it can include these project-specific cultural impact assessments, but it might also encompass an Āpiti Hono Tātai Hono assessment for some bigger purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
right. So the term cultural values report really holds a lot of
yes,
options, is what you're telling us, and
Correct.
it is at that full, large-scale spatial planning assessment was kind of the way it came up yesterday, to a very small project
yeah, it's
response.
it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a report that talks about cultural values, and there's many different ways to write a report that talks about cultural values. Some of them being doing an Āpiti Hono Tātai Hono assessment. There could become a time where the Runanga wants to write more traditional cultural impact assessments. That term would allow for that. It would allow for a more bespoke tool to be developed in the future that could be a lot smaller, a lot more agile. It just creates that flexibility and those options for applicants and the Runanga to talk about what those different options could be for them and theirs.
Thank you for that. That's nice and clear. Is there any benefit in actually including something in the glossary?
I would be interested in Hokonui Runanga's perspective on that. From my position that I'm in here, I can't see any negative from doing that. But I would be interested in Hokonui Runanga's perspective as well.
Yeah, because what you explained is nice and clear, and I think there is value in it being recorded somewhere and having it in the plan.
Yeah.
Would that relate a bit to the method text conversation we were having as well, potentially? So, like the glossary is one approach, but
Just in text, in
but
that section 5 area.
maybe, yeah, it would seem that there is a direct linkage here to that dialogue around the methods and where the text goes.
I'd agree with that.
Ms. Chadwick, your body language suggested you were about to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted, and I'm sorry, I feel like this probably isn't my bag, but I just also wanted to mitigate the risk that could be seen as something unduly weighty or expensive or huge. So perhaps the glossary would be useful to say it's sometimes as short as an email, you know, in terms of consultation outcomes. So
We'd need to get that clarity from
yeah,
the
that's right. So
Yeah.
saying that it's a report does imply that it's a little bit more than, because as you would have heard from Mr. Nicholas yesterday, and likely from many of the other Runanga experts through the process, sometimes there is just an email. It'll come through, they'll say, do you care about this?
or it's not
Yeah.
necessary. So maybe
Yeah.
that could be clarified, or whether it's not
Yeah.
necessary.
So sometimes it's that process of, does this ring any bells for you? No, that's fine, on your way. Sometimes it'll be, does this ring any bells for you? Yes, it does. Let us have a quick little look at this and respond. And then sometimes it's bigger again. It scales depending on what it is. So I think adding some clarity can be useful. Where that goes and what that, how that's packaged, that's something that I'd consider important for the Runanga to be involved in that, since we're effectively talking about their work.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions from the panel?
No, I'm just thinking about your last response, so I've gone quiet for that reason. I don't think I have anything else outstanding at this point.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of what we need to deal with today, and I'm interested in what you're about to say.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pipe up at the end of your conversation with the council consultants, just to check. There was a list that was gone through with Ms. Beeran yesterday, so I just wanted to see if that list had been reduced or potentially expanded, because there's some follow-up work that had been contemplated. So whether or not we need to do some sort of reconciliation to check whether that's some of that stuff from yesterday has been addressed by Ms. Bennett or not addressed or become more problematic, so that we can make sure that that next step can be as concise as possible.
I saw a need for even the things we talked about today needing to be documented as I guess, so that Amy Beran, in terms of what we've asked yesterday, is able to see that as well.
Would it be Ms. Beran, and then you've spoken about everything today and you're happy with it, or do you want to, is there anything else you wanted to tidy up?
I'm happy if the panel's happy.
So obviously this exercise that we've just been through was triggered by that quite substantial minute 15. I guess what we're talking about here, I think, is actually now just a very small piece of additional fleshing out evidence to back up the dialogue that's occurred through this hearing, make it just visible, and I don't know that it needs to be a long and complicated beast. So we're not talking about another minute 15.
I wonder if the gap
We've got the very beginnings of it here, and from some of the responses you've given. So it seems to me that the answers are sitting quite within reach. Yeah.
So one option is the gap analysis that you've mentioned be jointly provided as a follow-up to the joint response that was provided on minute 15. So perhaps, as you say, it's noting where there's been questions from the panel about the process followed, so that could be a joint response by both planners just to support that work, that substantial amount of work as you've acknowledged. And then separately Ms. Beran could come back. I'm happy to, I know Ms. Rolfe's watching online, but I'm happy to also have that dialogue with Council to make sure that that's facilitated before Christmas.
And that would be greatly appreciated, thank you. So if there is nothing further, we will adjourn until our next hearing date and deal with other issues as they arise. So thank you everyone for your input here today, and the staff as well. So we are adjourned. Thank you.